I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
Most people are familiar with what has come to be known as the hippie movement, the free-love, drug-consuming, lawn-haired anti-war counterculture that defined the majority of the 1960s. This era was, without a doubt, a turning point for Western society. The fighting for women's rights, the changes in fashion styles for both men and women, the rampant use of psychedelic drugs, and of course, the sexual revolution. And while one might assume that the culture was nothing more than an organic and natural response to the Vietnam War, is it possible that there was something much deeper going on behind the scenes of this supposed counterculture movement? Is it possible that the hippie movement was not simply the rebellious youth's response to the current establishment and US involvement in the Vietnam War, but actually the product of much research and social engineering that resulted in possibly the biggest cultural shift ever seen in the history of mankind? To answer that question, we need to go back in time before there even was a hippie movement. The early 20th century saw a massive increase of research and interest in the field of psychology. Different forms of psychological warfare were created and applied, especially in various POW camps. One interesting work from this period that discusses various methods of brainwashing and psychological manipulation is The Rape of the Mind by Hoost Meerloo, which was published in 1956. Hoost Meerloo spent much time observing and researching the effects of brainwashing and psychological warfare that were developed during and after the war. He recorded a number of examples of POW prisoners that had been psychologically manipulated and abused while in prisoner camps. He understood just how dangerous these psychological methods were and how they could be used. From his book he writes, "Psychology has delivered up to man new means of torture and intrusion into the mind. It is now technically possible to bring the human mind into a condition of enslavement and submission." In his book, he specifically mentions the famous psychologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, who conducted some of the most famous psychological experiments. The most famous one was with a bell and a dog. The bell would be run each time the dog was fed, which would in turn cause the dog's mouth to salivate. Eventually, the dog was conditioned to salivate at the ringing of the bell in anticipation of being fed. Based on this experiment, Pavlov assumed that if man was just another beast, he could be conditioned in a similar way and ultimately reprogrammed entirely. Hoost Meerloo mentions that the Nazis and Soviets attempted to utilize these Pavlovian psychological techniques before and after the Second World War, with the goal of turning man into a machine that could be conditioned to follow orders and commands without critical thinking. Hoost Meerloo, however, was aware that this was a massive oversimplification of the human mind. He understood that the human mind is much more sophisticated than the minds of animals. He did admit, however, that the research being done on Pavlovian conditioning was extremely dangerous, especially if the research and findings fell into the wrong hands. He understood the implications that these various methods could have on not just individuals, but the masses as well. He continues, "The tragic facts of political experiences in our age make it all too clear that applied psychological techniques can brainwash entire nations and reduce their citizens to a kind of mindless robotism, which becomes for them a normal way of living." As one would expect, many government agencies, both inside and outside of the US, became extremely interested in understanding and perfecting these various psychological techniques after the war. The most famous example being the infamous MKUltra experiments that were conducted by the CIA, which were preceded by other projects like Project Bluebird. The focus of Project Bluebird was to utilize and test various interrogation methods, including polygraph, drugs, and hypnotism. Simply put, the purpose of the project was to test various forms of brainwashing and mind manipulation tactics in order to retrieve and implant information into the human mind, similar to that of the MKUltra experiments that followed. Another key group that was conducting various psychological studies during this time was the Tavistock Institute, located in London. The Tavistock Institute was originally referred to as the Tavistock Clinic, which primarily functioned as the British Army's Psychological Warfare Bureau during World War II. After the war, the Tavistock Clinic was changed to the Tavistock Institute and was created to serve as a means of studying various brainwashing techniques and psychological warfare methods. The work that was done had heavy influence from Freudian and Pavlovian psychology. What's interesting about the group is that the funding for research done at the Tavistock Institute after the war came directly from the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation provided a grant that kickstarted the newly formed Tavistock Institute in 1947 that replaced the Tavistock Clinic. One of the key figures in the creation of the Tavistock Institute was a man by the name of John Rawlings Rees. John Rawlings Rees worked as a consulting psychiatrist during World War II and was one of the founding members of the Tavistock Institute. In John Rees's book, The Shaping of Psychiatry by War, he believed the best path for a society would be to make it possible for people of every social group to have treatment when they need it, even though they do not wish it, without the necessity to invoke the law. Essentially, Rees was advocating for forced brainwashing procedures upon people that were deemed worthy of conditioning, without the need for their consent. Another document authored by Rees is titled Strategic Planning for Mental Health. The document was authored in 1940, and Rees goes over his ideas and plans for furthering mental health treatment in the future, which would include conditioning the minds of the youth and taking control of key institutions like the church, education systems, and the field of medicine. John Rees can be quoted, "We can therefore justifiably stress our particular point of view with regard to the proper development of the human psyche, even though our knowledge be incomplete. We must aim to make it permeate every educational activity in our national life. Primary, secondary, university, and technical education are all concerned with varying stages in the development of the child and the adolescent. Those who provide the education, the principles upon which they work, and the people upon whom they work must all be objects of our interest. For education that ignores the common sense principles that have been more clearly evolved of recent years is likely to be of indifferent quality. Public life, politics, and industry should all of them be within our sphere of influence. It needs little imagination to see improvements that could be effected in each of them. Especially since the last World War, we have done much to infiltrate the various social organizations throughout the country, and in their work and in their point of view, one can clearly see how the principles for which this society and others stood in the past have become accepted as part of the ordinary working plan of these various bodies. That is as it should be, and while we can take heart from this, we must be healthily discontented and realize that there is still more work to be done along this line. Similarly, we have made a useful attack upon a number of professions. The two easiest of them naturally are the teaching profession and the church. The two most difficult are law and medicine. Anyone whose memory goes back for even a dozen years can realize how big a change has been effected in the outlook of professional people, while certainly anyone with vision can see how much still remains to be done. When you take a look at the beliefs of a person like John Rees, it gives insight into what kinds of people found and ran Tavistock during its early years. Daniel Estelin, who wrote the book Tavistock Institute, Social Engineering the Masses, writes in his book, "What is undeniable is that Rees and Tavistock were seriously organizing a cabal to take over the councils of those who were attempting to re-establish the world after the war." This idea makes sense when one realizes that Tavistock was not acting alone, but as mentioned before, had funding from the Rockefellers, who were arguably the most powerful people in the world at that time. Not only that, but the Tavistock Institute also influenced the United States OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA. It seems that the CIA worked with the Tavistock Institute in order to study various forms of brainwashing and psychological manipulation. Peter Kuski, in an article titled The Shaping of the Anglo-American SS by War, writes that, according to the OSS's assessment staff's post-war report, Assessment of Men, it was Dr. John Rawlings Rees and his Tavistock crew at the British War Office Selection Board who contacted the London office of the OSS to suggest that the Special Warfare Organization adopt Tavistock's selection and training methods. According to Kuski, the CIA is and was the primary establishment that has links to a number of institutions, even beyond that of the Tavistock Institute. The connections between the Rockefellers, the CIA, and other groups are numerous. Daniel Estelin mentions in his book, the CIA apparatus has penetrated every key organization, including think tanks, universities, non-governmental organizations, and foundations. He also mentions, many of the future leaders of the CIA came from America's ruling families, from a never-ending pool of bankers and industrialists, such as DuPont, Vanderbilt, Bruce, Mellon, Archibald, Morgan, and Roosevelt. It was these types of groups and families who founded and ran the CIA, that utilized the psychological research that was being done at places like the Tavistock Institute. So why is it that these families and groups that made up the CIA and other prominent organizations were so interested in studying psychology and the effects of brainwashing? To get an idea, let's take a look at the infamous series of recordings known as the Dr. Day tapes. The Dr. Day tapes are a series of recordings that were released in 1988. The tape's narrator was a man by the name of Dr. Lawrence Dunnigan. In the tapes, Dr. Dunnigan recounts a meeting that he had attended on March 20th, 1969. The meeting took place at the Pittsburgh Pediatric Society, which was located on Ridge Avenue in Pittsburgh. The members of the meeting were primarily pediatricians and doctors, with around 80 people in attendance. Lawrence Dunnigan reports in the tapes that the speaker of the meeting was a man by the name of Dr. Richard Day. Dr. Day was a professor and chairman of the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Pittsburgh from 1956 to 1965. From 1965 to 1968, he was a national medical director of Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is also an institution that has had heavy funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, similar to the Tavistock Institute. At the start of the tapes, Lawrence Dunnigan recounts how Dr. Day asked those in attendance to not take notes or any types of recordings during the talk. He even alluded to the fact that he would be in danger if someone were to be caught recording the meeting in any sort of way. Dr. Day told the people in attendance that there was a group of men who were powerful enough to influence the trends and events of the world. He said that that group of men had already planned out what changes were to occur in the future, and that they were already being set in motion. The people who run the world are not elected officials like most typically believe, but are actually people in private occupations. Dr. Day mentioned that most names would be recognizable to the audience if they heard them, but he did not specify any names. The purpose of the meeting, according to Dr. Day, was to help introduce the attendees of the meeting to the coming changes that would be rolled out in the near future and allow them to better adapt to those changes. Many of the changes that Dr. Day discusses include clothing, population control, religion, nutrition and exercise, education, sports, entertainment, and much more. For the purpose of this video, I want to address just a few topics that Dr. Day mentions in the tapes. The first topic, and arguably the most important topic, pertains to population control. What Dr. Day meant by population control had to do with not only limiting the number of births to control the number of the population, but more importantly, controlling the people of the population. So how would these elite rulers control people? As Dr. Day claimed before, there's a supposed group of people in high positions of power that have the ability to control and manipulate events and trends that are pushed out into the world. They would most likely be able to control these trends and events via mass brainwashing and mind manipulation tactics, similar to the same types of experiments being conducted by the Tavistock Institute, who just so happened to be receiving the same funding as the organization that Dr. Day was a part of. Getting deeper, Lawrence Dunnigan also brought up what Dr. Day mentioned about music. According to what Dr. Day said at the meeting, music would change over time, become worse as the years went on, and ultimately divide generations into various groups. The purpose of this would be to divide people of different ages and ultimately cause there to be division in the family unit. Dr. Day also went on to say that the music produced and released to the public will begin to have more sexual lyrics. The lyrics of such music will also contain messages and meanings that most kids and people listening would not be aware of. The ultimate purpose of promoting this music to younger generations, according to Dr. Day, would be to dumb down and ultimately brainwash the youth so that they are more easily controlled and manipulated. Dr. Day also went on to talk about drugs. He said that the plan of the elites was to push the overall drug use in society while simultaneously increasing the laws against them. While this sounds like a contradiction, it is intentional. The logic behind promoting drug use in the culture would be to filter out the weak in a Darwinian sense. The idea is to return the world to a state of the jungle, where the weak become susceptible to drug use that would be promoted in the culture, while the strong would not give in to such temptations. As Dr. Day mentioned, music and drugs would be two key components in controlling the population. Going back to the hippie movement, as most already know, two major aspects of the supposed counterculture were in fact drugs and music. And while one might just chalk this up to coincidence and think that there is no actual link between the words of Dr. Day, the CIA, the Rockefellers, and the Tavistock Institute, let's begin to dive in and investigate some aspects of the hippie or counterculture movement. Let's first discuss the world of drugs and how they relate to the 60s counterculture. As most already know, it was LSD and other forms of psychedelic drugs that were heavily promoted and used during the hippie movement. When talking about the use of LSD in the 60s, the one man that most typically think of is Timothy Leary, who we will talk about in a second. A lesser-known promoter of LSD, however, was a man by the name of Augustus Ole Stanley. David McGowan discusses this lesser-known character in his book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. David McGowan claims that Augustus Stanley was the premier LSD chemist of the hippie era, and the person who did the most to turn on the youth to LSD. Supposedly, Augustus Stanley was not even into distributing LSD for the money, and often gave away much of his product for free. According to some, Augustus Stanley was enrolled at UC Berkeley, which is where he is said to have learned to create his LSD product. He would create his LSD in a bathroom that was located near the university campus until he was raided by state narcotics agents. All of his lab equipment was taken, and Augustus was charged with creating LSD. Fortunately for Augustus, he was able to sue in order to get all of his lab equipment back, with the help of his attorney, who was also the vice mayor of Berkeley. Shortly after he was able to get his equipment back, he began to put it to use, where he successfully passed out nearly 4 million tabs of LSD throughout the 1960s, much of it for free as stated before. Augustus Stanley was not the only one with ties to UC Berkeley. Let's return to the better-known character and face of the psychedelic aspect of the counterculture movement, Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary is known for being the leading advocate of LSD and psychedelic drugs in general during the 1960s. He received a doctorate in clinical psychology from UC Berkeley in 1950 and began to lecture at Harvard in 1959. During his time at Harvard, he began to conduct psychedelic drug experiments with assistant professor Richard Alpert. According to the Harvard website, both Leary and Alpert were often criticized by their colleagues for the scientific merit of their research and the ways in which they conducted their experiments. By spring of 1963, both Leary and Alpert were kicked out of Harvard. But as many know, this was just the beginning of Timothy Leary's impact on the psychedelic drug community. Throughout the 1960s, Leary began to travel to various college campuses to promote the use of psychedelic drugs, primarily LSD, where he coined the phrase, "turn on, tune in, drop out."
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
Leary himself has gone on record mentioning the CIA's involvement in the counterculture and how they played a pivotal role in promoting the 1960s hippie movement.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
After the 1960s era, Leary went on to write an autobiography titled Flashbacks. In the autobiography, he quotes the famous Aldous Huxley where he says, "These brain drugs mass-produced in the laboratories will bring about vast changes in society. This will happen with or without you or me. All we can do is spread the word. The obstacle to this evolution, Timothy, is the Bible." This again validates the claims made in the Dr. Day tapes. In the tapes, Lawrence Dunnigan mentions that one of the plans is to remove all major forms of Christianity and ultimately replace it with a mythos that is more appropriate for the planned New World system.
Another area of discussion was religion. This is an avowed atheist speaking. And he said, religion is not necessarily bad. A lot of people seem to need religion with its mysteries and rituals, so they will have religion. But the major religions of today have to be changed because they are not compatible with the changes to come. The old religions will have to go, especially Christianity.
Timothy Leary went on in his book to say, "We had run up against the Judeo-Christian commitment to one God, one religion, and one reality that has cursed Europe for centuries and America since our founding days. Drugs that open the mind to multiple realities will inevitably lead to a polytheistic view of the universe. We sense that the time for a new humanist religion based on intelligence, good-natured pluralism, and scientific paganism has arrived. The reason that Christianity is a threat to many of these Pavlovian and Freudian-inspired psychologists and elites is because the Bible says that man is made in the image of God, which is fundamentally incompatible with the worldviews and systems that people like Leary and Huxley so desperately want to push towards." As many are aware, Aldous Huxley wrote the famous novel Brave New World. In the novel, society is broken up into 5 groups that are each assigned a different rank or hierarchical position when created. From the time that children are created in a lab, they are programmed and conditioned in order to become prepared and accept their future roles in society. Free will is simply not a part of Huxley's Brave New World. And while some like to maintain the idea that Huxley's Brave New World is nothing more than a piece of fiction, some of his speeches give more insight into just how real he viewed the supposed fictional world. At the California Medical School in San Francisco, he said, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak. Producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies, so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda, or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods, and this seems to be the final revolution." He gave another speech at Berkeley in 1962, and again mentions how the world is moving towards an era that will be susceptible to rulers who can control the masses via Pavlovian psychology and drug use.
It seems to me then that this ultimate revolution is really not very far away, that we already a number of the techniques for bringing about this kind of control are here, and it remains to be seen when and where and by whom they will first be applied in any large scale.
Huxley even specifically mentions how LSD and psilocybin could easily be used to cause enormous revolutions in the mind.
I mean, you can have an enormous revolution, for example, with LSD 25 or with the newly synthesized drug psilocybin, which is the active principle of the Mexican sacred mushroom. You can have this enormous mental revolution with no more physiological revolution than you would get from drinking 2 cocktails. And this is really a most extraordinary effect.
It's also worth noting that Huxley became acquainted with the famous occultist Aleister Crowley, whom he met through his friend and famous author H.G. Wells. We can see from the words of Huxley and Leary that they were well aware of how these various drugs could be used to manipulate the masses. I now want to move on to another aspect that defined the 1960s counterculture movement, which is that of the music industry. The world of music and abuse of psychedelic drugs almost go hand in hand when one thinks about the 1960s era. It was often at music festivals like Woodstock that people would spend days listening to folk rock while experimenting with drugs like LSD. Therefore, if we are to consider the possibility that the counterculture was engineered by people in high positions of power, it would make sense that the music industry would have some evidence or traces of this idea. It's important to understand the impact that music can have on the mind. We can take a look at the words of Theodor Adorno in order to better understand the ways in which modern music can heavily impact individual listeners. Theodor Adorno was a leading member of the Frankfurt School, a group of self-described intellectuals who sought to apply Marxist ideologies to Western society. Similar to the Tavistock Institute, they were also big fans of Freudian and Pavlovian psychology. In his 1948 work, The Philosophy of Modern Music, Theodor Adorno mentions the psychological effects that music would have on those listening. He wrote, "It is not that schizophrenia is directly expressed therein, but the music imprints upon itself an attitude similar to that of the mentally ill. The individual brings about his own disintegration. He imagines the fulfillment of the promise through magic, but nonetheless within the realm of immediate actuality. Its concern is to dominate schizophrenic traits through the aesthetic consciousness. In doing so, it would hope to vindicate insanity as true health." It's clear from his own words that Theodor Adorno understood the effects that modern music would have on listeners and that it would literally drive them to a state of insanity. Another prominent figure of the 20th century was Lord Bertrand Russel. Bertrand Russel was a famous philosopher and mathematician who also had ties to the Frankfurt School. He also was fascinated with the potential mass brainwashing techniques that were being developed. In his 1951 book, The Impact of Science on Society, he writes, "Physiology and psychology afford fields for scientific technique, which still await development. 2 great men, Pavlov and Freud, have laid the foundation. I do not accept the view that they are in any essential conflict, but what structure will be built on their foundations is still in doubt. I think the subject which will be of most importance politically is mass psychology. Its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. It may be hoped that in time, anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything, if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment." Lord Russell seems to be alluding to the idea that these methods were already being funded and researched. Not only that, but that the focus will be on the youth as a means to condition them into believing a grand narrative that will impact generations to come. Bertrand Russell goes on to talk more about how a scientific dictatorship will be the ones orchestrating such a world. He writes, "The subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. Although this science will be diligently studied, it will be rigidly confined to the governing class. The populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for a generation will be able to control its subjects securely, without the need of armies or policemen." And of course, he mentions how music could be used to condition young people. When discussing methods of psychology used to condition people, he wrote that, "Verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective." It's clear that the use of music and its effects on the mind were well known at this point, and many understood how they could be used to not only condition individuals, but masses of people as well. And not only that, but that the music should be specifically targeted to younger generations, as they were the most impressionable and easily manipulated. All of these traits seem to parallel the folk rock counterculture that was being heavily promoted during the 1960s. We can take a look at the 1960s music scene to understand just how bizarre the promotion of music during the counterculture really was. In David McGowan's book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, he goes over and documents the rise and fall of various musical artists that were massively popular during the counterculture movement. Some of the artists include the Doors, the Buffalo Springfields, the Mamas and the Papas, the Rolling Stones, and many, many more. McGowan also writes in his book about how many members of such groups had mysterious connections to various military intelligence agencies and were also closely connected to the infamous Manson family. It would be impossible to go over every single connection in this video, and I don't want to waste time listing every single fact, but I highly recommend the book to anyone who wants to get deep into the origins of each group. With that said, there are a few key characters and connections that McGowan lists in his book that I want to go over briefly. The first one being one of the most famous music groups of the 1960s, the Doors. The Doors actually named themselves after Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, which documents Huxley's experiences and thoughts regarding his psychedelic drug usage. The original members of the Doors were Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, John Densmore, and of course, Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison was considered an icon of the 1960s era and was well known as the face of the Doors. What many people are not aware of, however, was that his father was U.S. Navy Admiral George Stephen Morrison, who was the one in command during the Gulf of Tonkin event that is said to be what got America involved in the Vietnam War. Even more interesting about Jim Morrison is his sudden rise to fame and prominence as an icon for the counterculture. What many do not know about Jim Morrison was that he was not at all interested or passionate about writing songs or music in general. David McGowan writes in his book that James Douglas Morrison had never shown the slightest interest in music, none whatsoever. He certainly never studied music and could neither read nor write it. By his own account, he never had much of an interest in even listening to music. He told one interviewer that he never went to concerts, one or two at the most. And before joining the Doors, he said that he never did any singing. I never even conceived of it. Asked near the end of his life if he ever had any desire to learn to play a musical instrument, Jim responded, not really. It's apparent that Jim Morrison was probably the most unlikely guy to become an icon of 1960s music. What's also fascinating is that despite the fact that he never touched an instrument in his life, he came onto the music scene with a plethora of songs already written before the band was even formed, which would make up the Doors' early albums. Jim even mentioned himself that he was not a very prolific songwriter. Most of the songs I've written I wrote in the very beginning, about 3 years ago. I just had a period where I wrote a lot of songs. It seems illogical to think that a person who had never touched an instrument in his life would be able to come onto the scene with a variety of songs ready to go that would end up becoming hits. Jim Morrison's death is also recognized as being very mysterious in nature. He was found dead in his hot tub and no proper autopsy was performed. Not only that, but he died at age 27, which allowed him to join the infamous 27 Club. Another mysterious and unlikely group to succeed in the music industry would be the Byrds. The original members of the Byrds included David Crosby, Gene Clark, Michael Clark, Chris Hillman, and Jim McGuinn. David McGowan describes the group as an entirely manufactured phenomenon. The reason for this is because of the odd circumstances that made up the band's origins. Similar to the scenario that Jim Morrison was in, none of the members of the Byrds, except for Roger McGuinn, knew how to play instruments. Not only that, but when the band first formed, none of the members owned any musical instruments. Chris Hillman, who was the bass guitarist, even stated that he was a mandolin player and didn't know how to play bass. But the other members of the band didn't know how to play their instruments either, so I didn't feel bad about it. It's clear that since most of the Byrds had no idea how to play their instruments, that they would lack the ability to write songs as well, which is why they played and recorded mostly covers during their early days. Despite these seemingly major handicaps, it did not stop the Byrds and other bands from gaining massive amounts of attention and promotion from the media. The media would continuously promote the 60s folk rock scene through all forms of media, including print, radio, and television. As David McGowan puts it, new releases by the Byrds were often accompanied by large ads in trade magazines that simultaneously plugged the records and upcoming TV appearances. Time magazine and Newsweek frequently reported on the counterculture scene as well, by reporting on and interviewing bands like the Byrds, Doors, and Buffalo Springfields that allowed them to gain notoriety extremely quickly. Although most people typically view the hippie movement and counterculture as being anti-establishment and a threat to the status quo, then why is it that all of these corporate media mouthpieces spend so much time and money promoting these various bands that were fighting against the establishment? Although one could argue that it was simply the media and corporate America trying to make a quick buck off of the hippie trend, David McGowan raises a key question in his book. Why was nothing done to stop the growth of such a movement? Why did the same corporations that the counterculture was supposedly against continue to sign, record, and promote these various artists through the mainstream media? Not only that, but as mentioned before, the use of LSD and other illegal substances were heavily used and dealed by the artists of the same movement. This would seem like a perfect opportunity for such corporations and elites to take action against them. Despite their involvement in use and dealing of such substances, most of them when arrested were able to walk away with minimal, if any, sentencing. One example is David Crosby of the Byrds, who said that, "The DEA could have popped me for interstate transport of dope or dealing lots of times and never did." John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas mentioned that he was looking at 45 years and got 30 days. Beyond the use of drugs, the draft for the Vietnam War was also going on during this time period, which would have been a perfect opportunity to break up these various bands and quiet down the counterculture scene. However, it seems that practically no member of the music scene had their career interrupted by the draft. Many members of such bands say they came up with an excuse that allowed them to avoid getting involved in the war, such as being gay or pretending to be crazy or unfit for service. If it were that easy to avoid getting involved in the draft, however, it would have been extremely difficult to find people eligible for the draft, as no doubt many other young men were using the same tactics to avoid getting involved in the war without success. It seems more likely that instead the members of these various bands were not simply avoiding the draft through their lame excuses, but actually being protected from it by the same establishment and corporations that these same bands were being heavily promoted by. As David McGowan says in his book, a real grassroots cultural revolution would have probably involved a bunch of starving musicians, barely scratching out a living playing tiny coffee shops in hopes of maybe someday landing a record deal with some tiny independent label. And then, just maybe, if they got really lucky, getting a little airplay on some obscure college radio stations. But that's not how the 60s folk rock revolution played out, not by any stretch of the imagination. Another major component of the counterculture era were the heavily promoted and populated music festivals. Music festivals played a key role in the distribution of psychedelic drugs to the hippie masses. It was at these types of festivals that many were first exposed to the counterculture scene and where LSD experiments took place on a mass scale. The first music festival took place in June of 1967 and was called the Monterey International Pop Festival. Over 200,000 people were in attendance at the Monterey, California Fairgrounds in Northern California for the 3-day celebration. As Daniel Estelin mentions in his book, the Monterey Pop Festival could be viewed as a type of rehearsal for the widespread distribution of LSD and psychedelic drugs to the masses, which would become prominent at later outdoor festivals like Woodstock. According to author Robert Santelli in his book Aquarius Rising, the two characters responsible for the distribution of psychedelic drugs at the festival were a man named Peter Goodridge and a legendary CIA contract agent codenamed Coyote. It's also worth mentioning that one of the organizers of the festivals was none other than John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, who had various dark connections to the Manson family and other military intelligence that David McGowan writes about in his book. But of course, the most famous festival of the 1960s era was the Woodstock Music Festival. 2 days before the festival even began, roughly 50,000 kids had already arrived and drugs were already being circulated. Woodstock is said to have had over 500,000 people in attendance during the event. It was these 500,000 people who would participate in a weekend of debauchery that included sex, drugs, and rock. LSD was handed out by the handful. As the attendees experimented with LSD, many began to have bad trips which caused them to seek medical attention during the event. Rumors began circulating that perhaps the LSD or acid was poison. Rather than being discouraged from consuming more LSD, advice from the famous Hugh Romney, better known as Wavy Gravy, encouraged people to continue to experiment by just taking half a tab.
My name is Hugh Romney. I'm with a hog farm, and I'm working on a scene. Some people call it bum trips. I don't think there's such a thing as a bum trip. Now, people have been saying that some of the acid is poison. It's not poison. It's just bad acid. It's manufactured poorly. So anybody that thinks they've taken some poison, forget it. And if you feel like experimenting, only take half a tab, okay?
Some have come to believe that the famous Wavy Gravy had ties to the CIA, but it is just speculation. So what can we make of all of this information? Between the CIA's interest in brainwashing and mind manipulation experiments, the words of prominent figures such as Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary, the bizarre origins of various folk rock groups, as well as the claims made by Lawrence Dunnigan in the Dr. Day tapes, it seems that there was something much deeper going on during the 60s counterculture revolution than just a bunch of college kids trying to go against the status quo. If the claims made by Lawrence Dunnigan were correct, then perhaps it was people in high positions of power who used their resources to fund and ultimately fabricate an entire cultural revolution. The creation of this revolution would serve many purposes, such as dividing the family through generational gaps, the promotion of casual sex, which has now devolved into the modern-day hookup culture, and the introduction of various mind-altering drugs into the mainstream. It would also result in future generations to reject traditional values, leading to religions like Christianity to become outdated and irrelevant. There is no denying the fact that the 1960s was truly a turning point for Western society. In this video, I've just begun to scratch the surface of all the history and connections regarding this very mysterious and controversial era. And while I'm skeptical to believe that anyone knows for certain all of the details of what actually went on behind the scenes of the counterculture, the more I think and research, the more I am convinced that the 60s were not simply an organic response to the establishment and conventions of the day. I tend to believe that the culture and trends were purposely created and promoted by people in high positions of power for a specific purpose. If this were to turn out to be true, then that would mean that much, if not all of the various forms of media and entertainment, even beyond the music industry, are being used against us as a form of mass brainwashing, just as people like Hoost Merlu warned about decades ago. I'll leave it up to you to decide what you want to believe. I'll finish off with the words of Paul the Apostle, who wrote, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect."